All right, I think we're ready to go. Derek, do I still have you?
Yeah, you do.
All right, it's time for part two. Um, for those of you who are familiar with xenomorphs or just with the alien physiology, because this also can apply. Derek, did you see the two prequels, Covenant and Prometheus?
Seen Prometheus, did not see Covenant.
Okay. Well, Prometheus is fine because if I just mention black goo, uh, that hopefully will, you know, it has a life cycle as well. uh, Orchid Twilight had talked about a Chinese dragon that had a similar reproductive cycle to aliens. We discover that process through the prequel movies. And even in modern day, actual, factual, real life biology, there's something very common that occurs. That is that could be an inspiration, and that's wasps. Nature is scary, and if you want to see a real life xenomorph, look at a lot of different species of wasps who will parasitize caterpillars, even spiders, and like tarantulas and stuff. These are creatures that will they'll lay their eggs in the host, and life finds a way. um, and so that's the general concept. This is one of the terrors or the horrors that we face in Alien, because that can happen to you, and it's not a comfortable process to go through. And this can lend itself into body horror. There's even I don't know, like body horror is probably the lowest hanging fruit in that regard. Is there a for that cycle, Derek, or that would that even be like a psychological horror, or like is there something else we can extract from how the life of these creatures works, or would you say it's all body
Well,
horror?
I'm of two minds on it. I think you dismiss a little bit of the nature of body horror, because ultimately, probably the best example of body horror was, I believe, it was the '90s remake of The Fly.
Mm,
Okay, that's body horror.
okay.
Understand it's more than just how many ways can a person be hid, dismembered. It's the core of body horror is akin to cancer. It's your body, this thing that you identify as yourself, is turning on you, right? So to kind of dismiss that there's no psychological aspect to it is ultimately downplaying it. You can kind of goes back to what you were discussing earlier, where something could just be gross.
Yeah.
But when you talk about body horror, what you're doing is you are ultimately twisting something that is taken for granted, right? You look in a mirror, and what you see in the mirror you recognize as yourself, right? So what happens when that starts changing, right? How does that start impacting? That's still body horror. There is a psychological aspect to it. And to treat them separately, I feel almost misses the point, right? It's this idea that what you are as this unique amalgamation of, your parents, your grandparents, and all this, all the way here through to the first thing coming out of the soup. Like you were, what was it? You were the result of 6 billion years of evolution. Act like it
Yeah.
comes to mind. And then to realize that is turning on you, right? It's becoming something else. It's what are you losing first, your body or your mind? And if I'm going to pull a little bit of real world examples from this, there are individuals who have been told that they have had cancer, right?
Mm,
Then they go in for the checkup, see where it's going, and then they realize, no, it was a misread on our part. You know what the most common result of that is? When you're suddenly told, actually, no, we screwed up, you're clear. You know what the more often than not the reaction to that is?
Would it be
depression?
Really? I was going to be like, oh, maybe they like laugh, like, oh, thank you. Like, there's such a relief that.
No, it's kind of weird, but that is an example of that same trick that comes from body horror. And the reason that happens is because at that point, you kind of treated yourself as though you had an expiration date. So you had to end up putting your affairs in order. You had to end up making sure everything's good. You had to end up connecting all this. And that now becomes a portion of identity. Right?
Mm.
And now all of a sudden that this thing that has become a core part of your current existence was told to be a falsehood. Well, you just spent the past week rearranging everything, trying to end up getting ready to handle it, ready to tackle it, and now all of a sudden, it's not there. It's kind of a weird thing that ends up happening in humans. And again, pulling this into body horror, that's something you can end up breaking into when it comes to the psychological bit, right? The chest burster scene. What are you talking about? The second that you get one of those face huggers on you, you are on borrowed time.
Yeah.
That takes a tremendous toll upon a person. You start talking about the idea that, all of a sudden you wake up from cryo sleep and you see a facehugger on the ground. It's been long dead. And you start looking around and you're wondering, okay, we know when it's dead, it's already fulfilled its purpose. So now you start looking at everybody with a bit of suspicion. Who's acting up? Because you got to remember, for the most part, felt a little under the weather. Well, is that a cold, or is that telling me that you have impending doom about to explode from your rib cage?
Yeah.
Right? You start creating doubt. You start creating suspicion. Guess what? That's a huge component of it. What the alien does to you on a physical level is nothing compared to the sheer paranoia. Remember, its defense mechanism is acid, right? It literally has acid for blood. Hurting this thing is the worst option you can take. All right? If you decide, simple example, and I can't believe this is something that's missed through the rest of the movies, right? But when the first time they cut a facehugger in the original movie, there was a legitimate fear that this acid was going to eat through the hull.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
All it takes is to make a small
they chased
pinhole.
it down.
Yeah, they're chasing it down because they're trying to figure out what can we throw in this thing's way, get it to eat something else other than the metal that's going to expose them to the vacuum of space.
Yeah.
Right? So with that in mind, right, you look at this thing and you realize that it is ultimately this fight against the inevitable, and that is at its core alien. In every single alien, that is at its core, is this point of inevitability. We know this going in. We bought into the idea that inevitably things are going to go to hell. That is, and take a look at, again, I'll reference Alien 3, because honestly, I think it's the best movie of the franchise. I know I'm going to get heat for it, but I'm going to say it. Because look at how everybody's reacting. Look on how you start to know characters well enough, and it had some of the strongest characterization in the entire Alien franchise. I would defy anybody to try and end up showcasing me a character that's more well-rounded outside of Ripley herself than the entire cast in Alien 3. You had very strong bits, but why was that? Because they were put under immense pressure. You started seeing, guess what? You have one convict, if you watch the extended version, who utterly cracks and worships the alien, believing that this thing to be an actual demon. Right? We have another who is a medic trying to end up being the calmer head and all this. We have a warden who needs to end up making sure that no, my word is law. This cannot be challenged. That's more important to him than what's currently going on outside. This tells us immense amounts about these characters, and I can go on and on in this regard. But the key point here is that it's not just the alien in the body horror, though that is a component. How they react to it. Think on how Ripley reacts when she realizes it's a queen inside her.
Yeah.
Right? Start realizing what she's prepared to do, right? What she asks of the convicts, right? This is telling who these characters are when their backs to the wall, because they're not expecting help.
Yeah.
And in that, you want to end up figuring out when you're playing this, you will figure out not just by the stats, but who this character is. And as I alluded to last time we ended up having this discussion, well, that character came out of your head, so maybe it's a reflection on something you might be considering, or a path not taken. Knowing something a little bit more about yourself in that regard, and what is you facing what at least on the surface appears to be a no-win situation. Yep, rumor control, here are the facts.
With that, actually, so you really you got me thinking, because as we're gonna work from Alien back into other systems here, I was thinking, well, okay, so for the things you're talking about, in Alien, it is natural. It's a part of the ecosystem. It's a part of the terror, the building up to the horror. And it's a part of the presentation that you almost have to expect, which for those of you who run this system, even if you have friends who are familiar, lean into what they know. In fact, so I have this up here, that this is the GM's advice. And you'll notice that a lot of this advice is very similar to what you're going to find in Curse of Strahd. For horror storytelling, you're going to find it in a lot of things, because there are a lot of universal truths to telling a horror story. But you got me thinking. I'm like, all right, so we talk about the thing inside you and about the modifying of the body and whatnot, and I'm like, okay, well, so the Zamisi do that, but is there something an equivalent? And I said, you know what? In VTM, because we talked about that last night, the vampire, you're the monster. In VTM, you are playing the aliens. You are not of this world. You parasitize other people. And there's some that are very more dramatic for the manipulation of the body and such. But if you're like, oh yeah, I get face huggers and it's gross, or acid blood being disfiguring or whatever. If you want that, but you're playing the alien, can I suggest VTM? Is that an unfair comparison, Derek?
It isn't a completely unfair comparison. Again, both for me, one of the things that they have in common is the idea of inevitability.
Yeah.
In Vampire, the inevitability is not if you kill somebody, it's when. It's a guarantee that on a long enough timeline, you will kill somebody. And fact of the matter is that is to be avoided, because to end up doing so risks staining one's humanity, to end up losing it, lose a piece of who you are, right? You don't react quite the same as you would have beforehand. Certain things that would have been a concern to you at one point in your existence no longer apply. But in Alien, you can do the same tricks. Like horror, and this is kind of the dirty secret in a lot of horror, is that a lot of it follows a very strict formula. It's you swapping in what the proper nouns and verbs are, but it's the same. It ultimately boils down to the same sentence. That's why I said ultimately. I used to say that there is two classic horror stories, right? I talk about the shaman around the campfire, and he either says that the evil's outside beyond the light, or the evil's inside, right? But in both cases, they could arguably be the same story. And therein lies the rub, right? Your classic bit is, and it's the question, whence cometh evil? And you start, and a perfect example of that, if we're going to get into classic horror cinema, Night of the Living Dead, right? It's not the zombies that are the primary threat. They are the motivator, but they're not the primary threat. The primary threat is the people in the house slowly becoming more desperate, slowly starting to lose their minds, trying to end up evading what is outside. And playing around with that idea, right, is one of the core principles. Now, you can end up doing that for Alien, you can do that for Vampire, you can do that for Call of Cthulhu, right? But you need to end up being able to establish that, for lack of a better term, a sense of rhythm, right? This idea of watching the paranoia that happens. This isn't a unknown phenomenon. Like, the second you give anybody a reason to start looking side-eye at their neighbor, and they might try to go to their better nature, but ultimately we also see what happens with altruism in most horror movies, and shame to say that's a little bit truer to life than some people may be willing to admit. And we kind of end up getting lost in this world of horror when we're looking at, right now you're cracking open the Slaads. Myself, I'm more familiar with illithids, but
Slaads we'll get there next, I promise.
No, it's all right. It's what you pulled me in here for. So we're going to end up taking a look, or when we end up taking a look at horror, what you, as a storyteller, need to do is, or whatever you want to end up calling yourself, right? GMST, whatever. But you're trying to end up giving players prompts, trying to end up giving them a chance to kind of delve into this. How do you handle paranoia? A simple trick, right? I will hand every player, or I'll PM every single player a message, giving them a small amount of information. And I say, the only thing I ask is you never read this to another person. This is your information. I don't care if you don't talk to your significant other about this. Don't talk to your kids about this. Don't end up your best buddy. Don't end up doing any of it, okay? You need to know this one. And then I hand them a sheet. And when they read it, it might say something as simple as, "You are not the monster." That's it. Everybody got the exact same sheet. But what is that implying?
That it's creating just that implies that there is a monster among you, or that you are safe in the knowledge that you aren't. That might give you some impetus to inflict suspicion or something else onto someone else.
And this is something that we were having actually a discussion about with Coffee Cat, and that fat guy who is a part of Austin by Starlight. Because recently that has come into play, right? It's the perceived threat. And that has actually caused some intercotery conflict, which is coming out dramatically and beautifully. But fact of the matter is that this very fragile trust that happens amongst players, that is something fantastic to be able to run into. And, well, again, this is one of the core things about D&D. D&D, you're kind of in it together and you all got your roles to play and all that. It's very hard to disconnect from that, right? I am your traditional tank. I am your DPS. Whatever class you want to put into it. That's how I've experienced a lot of people who play D&D tend to think. So it's, how do I perform this role? But the second you pull into, like, Alien RPG, Vampire, or something like that, that thinking doesn't quite apply. Even in Alien, I'm pretty sure you noticed this, right? You can identify one or two people who might be a tank, But that's really not what they're there for. And that's ultimately not really the point. And therein lies one of the biggest hurdles I think most people have when it comes down to playing horror RPGs. One of the best horror RPGs I can think of right away, I believe it's called Dread.
Ah, yes.
Okay? And Dread is very simple for anybody who's ever ended up trying to run this. If you have a Jenga tower, you can run this. It's you start telling a story and ask players, what do you do? And every time they answer, they have to pull a Jenga block out and put it on top. The second that tower falls, that player's done.
Yep.
No roll of the dice. Skill issue is a skill issue. But it also builds that suspense because everybody's looking at that tower. Everybody's wondering what's happening there. And are they the next one that's going to have to perform an action? Are they going to need to pull from it? And that building of suspense is so natural. And well, again, I'm not as knowledgeable as Maddie is for the alien system. I just want to leave off on Maddie. Does this have a system that makes you fearful of making that next roll? Makes you fearful of performing that next action? Beyond the obvious, you're going to take damage.
The stress dice does, because of what can happen if you stress out, because it can get out of hand pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. And so pushing yourself is always an option, but there is a consequence in Alien for doing so. Just like there is, the ST says, I'll let you succeed at a cost. In Vampire, if you out there don't know, storytellers are the DMs of Vampire, or the GMs of a lot of other systems here. And you can push yourself, and you can build up a stress level, and bleeding off stress is not always an easy thing to do, either mechanically or just circumstantially to the story. It's not like a very traditional D&D game where you can take an hour, a short rest, and oh yay, my status ailments are gone, or I get some spell slots back, or you're a warlock, I'm at full power after a nap. It can be harder to bleed off that stress. So accumulating it over the course of a session is probably going to happen, and managing it, being very careful about it, is a part of the game. Because you don't want to be face hugged, but you also don't want to end up in a catatonic state where you slump to the floor and you're right at ground level for that to happen. So you might choose, it's a risk, and I'm going to go full auto because I have to land some bullets in this thing to stop it, and I'd rather be stressed out than have a face hugger impregnate me with a chest burster. And so it's a lot of asking, is the juice worth the squeeze? Because you'll always be offered the juice. And the question is, how much do you want to squeeze? How hard? In this system anyway. Like, how much do you want to push through what's pushing also against you? And now this system is built, and Vampire is built to manage it, because these themes of pressure and build-up and horror are intrinsic to those systems. And I did have the slot up, not just for the very the straight-up reference of, look, if this isn't a chest burster, I don't know what to tell you. This is part of their cycle. Though where D&D can suffer from its default presentation that many of us are used to, it might be different at your table, and if so, congratulations, you're taking those extra steps. But in D&D, if you look at a stat block, if you were to fight a red Slaad and become hit, you get a chance at having an egg implanted in you. It's mechanically treated as a disease. And then there's, you have, it says about 3 months or so. And of course, what can happen in that process. how vast is magic? How accessible would remove disease or other curative spells be that you don't really get in? Vampire has magic and other mysterious stuff, but there's not necessarily a mechanic like that would be built into the system like it is in D&D. And in Alien, there may be ways to treat someone who's been implanted, but it's not exactly common. It's not like even like a video game. Oh, here's a filthy syringe in an abandoned toilet. I'm going to jab into my arm and my health meter goes back up.
Hey, don't knock those syringes, okay? They end up saving me a whole lot out in the wasteland.
Toilet morphine. Probably expired.
It expires in the wasteland? What are you talking about? Fallout.
So in D&D, you need to be careful if you want to tell horror. You can have the Slaad be itself a singular horrific creature. And by the way, Derek has been a guest on this channel in many instances. Derek turned a flump into a horror creature. All right, everyone? I want you to know you can find terror and horror in a lot of things. And he did an amazing job off the cusp. But I want to bring this back to D&D because in the general presentation of D&D, unless you're playing with a specific group, specific set of rules or something, being impregnated with a Slaad egg is an inconvenient mechanic that most likely can be resolved pretty quickly. And so the opportunity to build the tension may not be there. This is simply something of a numbers game. Do you have the magic slots and the magic spells in the slots to make the disease go away? Or, can you pass the saving throw because it's just something you can save against? And of course, if you're a fighter, you could just be indomitable, which can make for some pitched storytelling. But just going out after a monster, you're like, oh, the Slaad are totally aliens because they can put eggs in you. You have to appreciate and understand what terror is, what horror is, if you actually want this to be a threat. Because here we have a whole book that will even go through the detailed process of how the xenomorphs reproduce, how it could possibly maybe be addressed in some way. Here we have in the VTM book, you're playing the monster, but there are systems where there's no real cure. This is a book of infliction. This is not a medicine book. This is not something where, there's necessarily just, it's just make a con save and then you can shrug this off. And so I do want to bring up, you have something like the Slaad. If you take the time and the detail, you can make this into a singular, horrifying monster like a Xenomorph in Alien or Alien 3 that Derek brought up. Or can you imagine, sure, you might save and you might burn through spell slots to remove disease. You only get so much of those, and if you're in an entire nest of Slaad, they're not going to run out of eggs before you run out of spell slots. So it can be built up, but if you treat this as, just it's a monster, then you might be losing the point there. And I want that to be cautious, that there are similarities in D&D monsters to other things or in folklore that we've heard about. But for the most part, they are presented to you as stat blocks. There are blurbs of text above that can give consideration for you to run, but you have to supply it. Other systems will supply you with the tools for terror and horror and thrills. If you're just reading this, well, it can be scary, and of course it can cause concern, but if it's one Slaad, one egg, one spell slot, then it's, oh man, really, I have a Slaad egg in me? That's an inconvenience. Spell. Alright, horror's over, and then you move on from there. Something else, now Derek said that he can talk more at length about this. Derek, I'm going to go to... shoot, I forget if they're under I. Intellect Devourer, actually. You want to talk about something that's kind of like a face hugger, almost literally.
Actually, different. It comes from a different bit.
Oh yes.
It's Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Oh, that's right. Yes, yes, yes. Um, so there you go, everyone. I hope that you're keeping your notes in your history on here. Now, there's a lot more lore and a lot more things that are very overtly alien and creepy and spooky that are given to mind flayers, even over the Slaad, over intellect devourers, which are related to the mind flayers, the illithids. This in the D&D context are set up to have more weight and more consideration, where at least the books are trying to supply you more terms to produce terror and horror. But with the conversation that we've had, then Derek, can you? You don't have to give a storyline or something overarching, but again, we see Mind Flayer. There are some general roleplay prompts. There's some creepy looking drawings up here, but when we come down to it, we have a Mind Flayer occupies one stat block on page 222 of the monster manual, and really, for all we know, they have tentacles, extract brain, and a mind blast, and that's the terror and that's the horror. Drawing on the elements that we've talked about, I mean, obviously tonight is an alien RPG themed. There is the concept of the tadpole and how mind flayers come about through their own reproduction cycle. Can you give D&D enjoyers the a concept if they want to? Maybe I'm not phrasing this correct. How can we build a bridge between Alien RPG and D&D, and using the Mind Flayer perhaps as the concept for the bridge? Does that make sense?
So, using the Mind Flayer as a way to kind of bring a flavor of Alien RPG into Dungeons and Dragons. Do I understand that correctly?
Let's weight it so that, because we're going from a base of operations that most of us are very saturated with D&D, we may already be super familiar with Mind Flayers. How can we take that as a comfortable concept to maybe get people to think about playing Alien RPG, because we can extract familiar concepts from D&D to present it in Alien. Now, we don't have to get into the Alien mechanics, but can we talk about this D&D monster in such a way that if you know this about Mind Flayers, you absolutely have the storytelling skills for what it would take to run some sort of content in Alien. Is that a better clarification?
No, that's fine. So right away, the very first thing I am thinking of the fact that it very much follows the. It's almost like a slot, but Mind Flayers are actually probably more appropriate. Slaad kind of like slap you, and if you run away, well, they're not really going to chase you. They know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Right? Mind Flayers are a little bit more insidious and operate a little bit more like aliens in that regard, or the Xenomorph from Alien, because they will capture and contain. Right? If you've seen the Baldur's Gate intro cinematic, for instance, the new one, we showcase the pools that they end up using to infect and create more mind flares. You are also looking at, if you've ever ended up running Conspiracy, right? Admittedly, mind flares are a lot easier to do Call of Cthulhu, but the flip side on it is you can very much look at an illithid and end up realizing that, actually, again, I'll bring to Alien 3. Remember, we had one who worshipped this thing. It was the dragon, right? You can pull that very much from Mind Flayer, right? Mind Flayers are things that are frequently worshipped. They are almost treated almost like lesser gods in certain contexts. They're not just a monster, they are something else. And that something else is the big factor you want to end up bringing in when it comes down to Alien RPG. And if you've ever run If you feel like you've run Mind Flayers successfully as something not quite right, again, they're an aberration. That's the core of being an aberration, something not quite right, something that doesn't naturally fit in the world. That's what the xenomorph is, right? Think about it. Well, you have blood that is acidic, right? Well, it might be a fantastic defense mechanism, right? That's a property that we don't see. We're not really sure on how it would even come about. And that's kind of the same ambiance you're looking for when it comes to a mind flare. If you think about the scenario, right, of realizing, try and imagine this one, if your big bad realizes, right, sees the power of a mind flare, of an illithid, sees that they are capable of almost commanding in this regard, like controlling individuals. They might not understand an intellect devourer, they might not understand an oblex, but they understand that these things seem to be able to control everything around them, and that they are almost entirely more intelligent than the average humanoid. They're something else. The psionic powers, the control, the dominate capabilities, all these little tidbits. Well, you start to think about that and you realize, wait. But a human being can become one. What if I were to master that? What if I were to able to transform myself but maintain myself? I need more research. I need to end up getting my hands on one. I need to get my hands on a tadpole. How do I do that? Well, there seems to be this group of adventurers who have a cart and seem to be willing to do some dirty work. I know that these things live raiding up from this mine to collect hosts. So what if I were to tell them to go over to that mine and collect me few bits of ore, some mithril or whatever, something that's not actually in there, so they'll be looking for a long time. And when things go wrong, they eventually come back to the surface, and, well, maybe they'll have collected that sample. Something I can experiment with, something I can grow, and I can start to figure out exactly on how this transformation operates. If you can see that plot line, you can run Alien. That is Alien 2.
That
running a D&D campaign.
It just, as you were telling that, because I mean, obviously I'm listening to you here. I'm going, wait a minute, hold on. That's yeah, that yeah, Derek just presented a fantasy version of the lead up to Aliens. It did sound very familiar, and so I think that's a very powerful example for you out there, where if it helps to, if you take this fantasy concept and maybe you like the fantasy horror or illithids are your thing. I mean, we had a movie plot that had just a veneer over it, and some of the mechanics are different because you're building dice pools or whatever. Don't worry about that. The mechanics will happen. You and your players will sit down and you'll figure that out. The fun doesn't always come from the roll of the dice. It comes from that story. And so here, you could take it both ways as the bridge. He just gave you a fantasy plot of how you run Aliens in D&D, or more powerfully, because I want to encourage you all out there. I love 5th edition. I'm all, although hot take, Derek said he likes Alien 3. I like 4th edition. So, I mean, we all have our things. But what he just did, if you didn't catch it, it might have been so subtle, is he just told you how you can take your knowledge of D&D and translate it into these other systems. And he also brought up Call of Cthulhu, which I don't know if you can or want to tomorrow night, Derek, to conclude the workshop week, but at least I'll be here to talk about Call of Cthulhu, and we can get into concepts of like cosmic or eldritch horror in that regard. And I have a fun book I'm going to read to you all as well. It shouldn't have your eyes roll up in the back of your head, I promise. But Derek just did an amazing thing where if you want to focus on the horror, you either want to instill horror in D&D because you're tired of monsters just being stat blocks. There you go. Or you want to take the familiar concept and turn it into the sci-fi one. Give it a look that way too.
Slightly related note. Slightly related. In Edmonton by Night, we had to say goodbye to Lethality Complex. Life was changing, things got in the way, he had to end up exiting. So I figured, how do we end up making sure that his character goes out the right way? And long story short, his character is, well, without getting too much into the details, suffice it to say they are a very wealthy individual who has made their fortune primarily dealing with nanotechnology, specifically, if anybody's familiar with Vanta Black, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this idea of here is literally, it's not quite a paint, but it's applied kind of the same, that is so dark that it absorbs 99.999% of light. Well, this had some tie-ins to what was going on in the plot, but one of the things I ended up saying is that, it turned, you got a message about samples in the lab that you own, but you don't remember okaying these experiments. What's going on here? It turns out that some stuff was being checked out. There was another group inside his own company who was using his money in labs for research into something else, and when he started to go no, okay, I need to figure this out, starts rolling science checks and all this kind of stuff, he takes some of this and puts it through a spectral analysis machine or something of the equivalent. I forget the full details. But the second he puts it in, all hell breaks loose. The container here breaks open and he finds himself swallowed up in the void, to the point where outside of anybody who was in that lab has utterly forgotten his existence. If you were to mention his character's name, he was famous before the incident. Everybody knew him. His company was owned. It was big, name and everything. Now it's treated like outside of his acknowledgement, life, there's otherwise no difference.
It was like Liquid Oblivion or something?
Actually, he's currently in the Shadowlands. But that being said, after I ended up saying this, I told him, congratulations, man, you Gordon Freeman'd yourself. And he thought about it and realized his ending was literally the opening segment of Half-Life. Right? So yeah. I just reskinned it, but because of the context, I basically took a beginning and made it into his ending.
Yeah.
And he was extremely ecstatic about that, because it wasn't until afterwards he realized I put the sample into the machine and all hell broke. I Gordon Freeman myself. Right? And that was how we wrote him out of the plot. Which, it was all in good fun, but this is an example of, don't be afraid to pull from stories you know. If you reskin them a bit, understand, I tell my people this all the time, okay? I love to draw comics, but I do not trust always my writing style. Apparently, some people really, really love my games, but, if I were to sit down and actually try and write a script out, I feel like I'm hitting my head against a brick wall. But whenever I start pulling like this and just bringing little pieces together, suddenly, it's all too familiar to me, but because of the reskin and just changing a few elements, people can't be sure about what they're encountering until after you say it. And if you have any, maybe your thing isn't horror, but you remember a scary element or when things got particularly tense, right? You can pull from all kinds of bits and kind of plug it into your game in this regard. In Alien, it makes it particularly easy to do, because guess what? You're not a fan of horror movies? Watch Aliens. It's the second film, and it stands alone. Yeah. I mean it. You do not need to see the first one. If you're looking for something that's more of a campaign setting, watch 3. If you want just that visceral alone, stuck in a small ship with something trying to kill you, Take a look at the original Aliens, and you will notice that a lot of these basic tropes in horror, the reason they're tropes is because they work.
Yeah.
It's the dirty secret that I don't think a lot of people want to admit, but something only becomes a trope when it's effective at doing what you need it to do in the story. When it becomes trite is when it's used badly.
This.
And that's the
100%
trick.
this, everyone.
Hey, down today. How's it going?
Welcome. Raiders.
Welcome, Raiders. But yeah, like, and this goes back to what I was talking about earlier. And I said it before and I'll say it again. Reality, there's only 2 stories in horror. And you can break down every single horror movie into effectively one of 2 stories. And the second you realize that, you can start plug and playing elements. And you will be able to craft. You can craft your own stories. You can craft your own chronicles. You can craft your own episodes. You can build up from that, so long as you understand that core tenet, right? And it comes from that one question: from whence cometh evil? And depending on what style of story you're trying to tell, will tell you where to focus.
Yeah. Bell the Cat had a question. How does Alien RPG resolve conflict in horror setting? Now, Bell, I brought up the mechanics. This is the main mechanic for Alien RPG about conflict in horror. Like, what raises the stakes to get us as the players more concerned about the events, or things that are going to help us simulate the feelings of terror that our characters would, even if we as the players aren't. And all right, Down to Die, thank you for coming over. Thank you for the raid, and be well, my friend. I'll see you around. And there are ways to do that here with the panic roll, ways to relieve the stress, and even the effects that it can leave on you, permanent mental trauma. And this is a game as well that does have critical hits that aren't just extra damage, as the sort of vanilla presentation of D&D does. Now, even in the Dungeon Master's Guide, there is they do offer as optional rules, so it's not just baked into what's going on. There are rules for slow healing and for lingering injuries as well in D&D, but for more focused roleplay systems like Alien, you get critical hits and you are missing limbs. And it's not that in the world you probably can't get a replacement arm, but you can't do it right now. And there's no magic spells to stop the bleeding. And there's, you're also probably being chased by something or someone who's terrible. And that could even be someone who's on your own team. As we were discovering earlier, I think before you joined us, Belle, with Alien RPG, especially in what they call the cinematic mode of play, you are encouraged to give every player their own agenda. Yeah, it's a vastly more lethal game. This could be just survival. This could be you're actually secretly working for the company and you got to get a sample off planet. This could be you have a sense of pride that courage. Your courage that everyone lauds you for is foolhardiness. And if you don't make a last stand, in Vampire, this would be sort of like a compulsion or like a clan bane that people might have. That it might, I don't know, you're the type of person in a zombie movie, Derek, was bringing up like Night of the Living Dead and whatnot. And there's the character who snaps and throws open the gates, letting the zombies in or something. That might be your character. Like your character, if you are reaching a certain point, is going to go down in a blaze of glory, regardless of anyone else. And so the other characters are going to have to deal with this happening. Note passing, yes. In let me make sure I'm presenting this correctly. When I ran Destroyer of Worlds for my local friends here, the kit that has the story and everything also has cards, reference cards, that are effectively notes that I hand to the group. And as the story takes place over a couple different acts, each of them have a particular condition that evolves as the events of the acts play out. And that is note passing from just the game mother, the GM, to the players. Or there might be players, if you're playing a custom home game, where you do pass notes, because maybe two of you are actually in on getting the sample out of the lab. Or you can play them off of each other where both of them work for the company and they both know that. One of them has to get the sample off, but the other one is sort of like an Ada Wong style, like turncoat, and will help the other friendly people, but will also betray their fellow company person for someone else. And so you can weave in personal intrigue that is a part of the game, and as such, the players should be aware that there are the personal agendas as well, but that can weave into the horror and the resolution and even ramping things up. Since someone might, I forgot to grab something back in this room, and they need to go back to the ammo closet because they needed some more ammo, and that's when they send a message out to, whatever, a rival faction or something along those lines. Yep, so the GM in Alien is the game mother, because Mother is the overarching AI system that's presented in Alien here. And so they have a couple of different forms of play. The short term is more that thrills, where it is a series of fast-paced events, and most of the people probably aren't surviving, just like in the movies. And so everyone can have fun in that regard, because don't get me wrong, you want to invoke horror, but you also want people to have fun, and that could be part of it. We all start at the beginning of the game, and we're going to see who makes it out. And even the people who are off on the side can either just witness and cheer on, or you can, as the GM, hand the people who are whose characters have faced retirement, an earlier retirement than perhaps they wanted to, as a note passing. You can pass them the card, because look, the Xenomorphs are intelligent, maybe not in the way that we might classically ascribe, but it can save you a lot as the GM, a lot of extra running and managing stuff, because you might ask one of the people who died at your table, one of the characters who died, their pilot, you hand them the card and maybe a custom note of, pop out of the vent here, or your job is to single-mindedly harass this party until you die, or you can drag one back to the nest. Simple instructions, but it still keeps everyone involved, and you've still given an intelligence to the enemy while keeping yourself as the GM, the game mother, the one who's telling the story. You can focus on narrating things. How do things look, smell? Do you hear the drips? Oh man, is that condensation from the AC? By the way, Derek, that's one of my most favorite scenes. I know there's some classic ones, like the one with Ripley and the alien in 3. The dude with the mop bucket in the bathrooms. As he's mopping up the mess that was there, and he's just like
trying to keep his head low, looking up.
Yep. That was a powerful scene to me.
It goes back to what I was talking about, right? You as the game mother in this case can do as much as you can, but ultimately it is always the reaction. It is the character's reaction that will ultimately build that sense of suspense, of that sense of fear. And that is very, very difficult for a lot of play groups to kind of get into. It's one of the things that I found is very different when you come into Alien RPG. And if you're willing to embrace that, if you're really willing to roll with it, if you have experience with a little bit of improv in that regard, you can tell some fantastic stories. The hardest part is really setting the tone. The in-game mother here needs to end up focusing on setting and serving as the example. And it's one of the best things you can end up doing, especially if you're jumping into this, is to serve that same example. It's kind of like, how do you get somebody to start role-playing in the first place, right? Well, you need to end up giving them that jumping in point to actually see this in action, to end up being able to end up building up these characters and what have you, and you'll find you can entice them along and help them develop the skills in that regard. Well, you got to be able to put that step forward as well. But when it works, hands down, there's a reason that I absolutely love horror and tabletop role-playing games, and there is none better. There is none better of an experience when it comes down to role-playing games, when you realize that this story, this bit of tension, this horror is coming as a collective, coming out of that collective unconscious that ends up coming from the entirety of the group, which makes it always unique every single time.
Yep. All right, for all of you out there, so we've had this look at horror. We've been able to translate some concepts to and through VTM, and especially back to Dungeons and Dragons, since that's where we cut a lot of our teeth. It's just now that our teeth need to sink into a couple other things every now and again. We got to keep them sharp. We got to keep them. We got to keep them going. Now, I don't really have a time in mind. I don't think it could be this month, because there's a lot of things that I still got to do, and this is also your spooky season, Derek. But with me having resolved the 4-year D&D campaign that I'd been running here, I would like to go back to a 5 broadcast day and to do some other content. If I did a short form story, like let's say I ran the tutorial out of this book, or I even ran the starter, if it's on a day or time that you'd be free, would you be interested in playing a game of Alien RPG if I ran it?
Absolutely.
Well, all right, if that's the case, I'd like to have you aboard, and obviously we'll work out a days and times for it. But I would like to showcase. I will always go back to D&D. I believe it's a great touchstone. It's a centralizing force for a lot of us. But I also would like to showcase some different systems. And if I can do that, especially if I ran Alien RPG, and hopefully a lot of you out there, we have 40 people watching us, hopefully you'd come by so you can learn how the game is run and played, but with characters like Derek. I mean, Derek is a person, but Derek is also, he's quite a character himself. Let alone the characters the character plays, you know? I think this could be a lot of fun. And I hope to be able to present something that does have the mood and the theme that would be tense, because as maybe a lot of you realized in my discussion of horror, the D&D game that I ran had an intense horror element to it, and I will directly blame Derek for that. He was the cause of and solution to all of the world's problems. Well, then I will leave that vague. Oh, it would be nice to play. I'll leave that dangling out there. We're gonna finish out October. I also owe you a BattleTech game at some point, Derek. So you and I have a lot more interaction that we got to have. Speaking of combat in space, and not that BattleTech can't also feature thrills or terror or horror, but I need to try and blow Derek's mechs up with my own pew-pews for honor and for there are some stakes as well.
Well, let's be honest here. We're doing it for the C-bill. Get paid. No, I appreciate that, Maddie. Like I said, I've I have a few loose projects in the background, as you saw earlier on when I was doing the how to end up starting to build a Roll20 game for
Yes.
Vampire the Masquerade. You caught a quick glance at me working on some mutants and masterminds in the background.
I saw that. I saw it. I'm like, yes, yeah.
Oh yeah, I absolutely do. I want to end up bringing that in. Certainly, there's a lot of game systems I would love to end up bringing about. Fact of the matter is my biggest problem personally as a gamer in tabletop RPGs is that I have this tendency to go depth versus breadth, right? And a simple example of that is a lot of people ask me, why don't you teach Wraith? Why don't you teach Changeling? Why don't you teach Mage? And the reason is that when I run into a system, I want to go very deep. I've kind of showcased an example of this with the mechanics of Vampire. I need to understand it more than just what does this role do? What is it trying to convey? More than just a have you succeed or failed skill check, right? And I'm trying to get to that level with mutants and masterminds before I end up going any further. I want to also be able to build up a few because there's like out of the systems I would love to portray, at least like give some spotlight time. I want to be able to do some mutants and masterminds. I want to do some Call of Cthulhu. I definitely want to run and this is something I've been trying for in the works. The difficult part is timing players, of course, because that's the final boss and everything. I want to run a spread of a BattleTech campaign that's literally bounces between BattleTech Classic, a game of armored combat, Alpha Strike, which is going to be getting a new box pretty soon.
Yep.
That I just kind of looked at and like the value in that box just blew my mind. Trying to make sure that I can end up doing a little bit of Destiny and a Time of War. So these are the role-playing components to it. I want to be able to end up being able to present that kind of stuff. I want to, delve into mutants and masterminds because I have this pseudo comic book universe in my head. Not quite like kind of pulling a little bit of inspiration from My Hero Academia, not so much as that you're in an academy, but in the idea that here are all the flavors of various different comic book ages and all that coming together, right? You will have try and imagine Spawn having to interact with the very first version of Superman. Right? Like having those moments and trying to build up off of that. I'm still making it to come together. But I think that there's a lot more we can end up playing around with, and I'm hoping to be able to end up doing more with it. I know that you're a sucker for mutants and masterminds. You want to end up seeing that going. I want to see that going. And there was, like if you remember way back when I did a sketch for a particular character called Rapunzel, and I want to end up making sure Rapunzel is a character in that universe. I love the concept, right? It's a twist on Medusa. Kind of this combination of, Wonder Woman and Medusa going together. I love these little concepts and building them out, fleshing them out. I want to see what else I can end up doing. And playing off of like old school heroes as well as the new stuff, right? Try and imagine. I know, Maddie, you're probably one of the few who would get this reference, but try and imagine All Might from My Hero Academia.
Okay.
Having to cross paths with the Shadow.
Oh, all right.
Now, like, if you're familiar with the Shadow from the old pulps, there's a perfect example of it. Like that's what I'm currently trying to end up fleshing out. And, I haven't figured out all the mechanics, unfortunately, but...
so the mechanics to that, as a quick aside from aliens and everything else, The core of it is everyone just needs one d20. You roll the d20 and add the modifier. It's just that there's so many different options because you can build anyone with this system. So there's a lot there. I would suggest, my suggestion to you is, work with the players, like let the player build their concept and focus on the specific powers or tech that they're getting. And don't worry about the rest necessarily, because there's so much in the world of powers and tech and hero stuff. So I would not. It's like trying to memorize the spell list in D&D. I've been playing D&D forever, and I can't tell you all the spells. So don't let that overwhelm you, because because everything is just roll 20 and add your modifier, and the different power levels will just give you a different modifier.
Fair enough.
You have the story. Focus on the story, because the mechanics are roll a d20 and see if it does the thing that it needs to do. You will go cross-eyed if you look at that rule book and you try and memorize all the powers and think about how things work, because just like in comics, there's always downfalls to every power. There's always someone else whose one power will be the solution to your ultimate attack or whatever. So there's like the core rhythm of how things play out, and let your specific players focus on their powers and bring those powers to the story that you want to present. Because just like with comic books, well, we hope anyway, Western comics have, in my opinion, been having, at least the major brands have been having a hard time with telling a story. That's why manga has been dominating Western comics for a while now, because
Maddie, if you start me on that trail where I'm not going to be able to leave for the
all
next
right, then
hours.
Derek, I'm going
to say I'm looking forward to when I'm finally ready to present Terror of Arcadia City.
Good.
Well, Maddie, on that note, I'm going to end up leaving you to end up being able to end up finishing up this broadcast, and I'll see if I can make some time for you tomorrow, depending on how things end up shaping up.
Yep.
And if so, I guess I might need to refresh myself on some old Call of Cthulhu ideas I had going on.
Yep. Well, it'll be talking concepts. We can, as we talked about sci-fi horror and stuff here, I want to talk about the big differences between cosmic horror, Eldritch, that sort of a thing. We don't have to get into the pure mechanics. We can explore insanity in Call of Cthulhu, but it'll be the broader horror storytelling concept in that regard. But yes, I'm going to let you go. For all of you out there, I'm going to take us over into a raid to Good Enough Painting. We're talking about minis and painting kobolds and stuff. Good Enough is a fellow Ohioan, actually, who does painting. He does. It says Good Enough. He does a great job. He's very dynamic and fun to talk to, and does a great job on his minis. So let's go raid Good Enough Painting. I'll see you over there. I will be in Discord. Don't forget, Raven, if you can put a link to Derek's Discord as well, please go check out Derek on Twitch. Go to his mosh pit on Discord. It is not PG-13 like we keep it, but I think you'll have a fun time there as well. Tetrashon, Thank you for hanging out. Cloaking Dust, Orchid, everyone else, thank you for joining us for this conversation, and I'll see you over in Good Enough.